Max Karol Auschnitt, also known as Auschnitt, Auschnitt or Auschnitt, February 14, 1888, January 18, 1957, was a Romanian businessman and political figure, one of his country's most prominent industrialists during the interwar period. Born to Ukrainian Jewish immigrants, he spent much of his youth abroad, returning in the 1910s to set up business as an importer of sheet iron, greatly expanding his father's fortune after World War I. Auschnitt was caretaker, and from 1929 managing director, of the Iron Domains and Factory (UDR) of Rosita, as well as founder of Titan Dragkauen (TNC), regional partner of Vickers Armstrongs, and investor in many other fields. Primarily known as the Iron King of Greater Romania, he had a business connection, and later a consuming rivalry, with manufacturer Nicolae Malaxa. The two were associate owners of Creditanstalt, which established their presence in Europe. First elected to the Senate as an independent corporate member, Auschnitt turned to partisan politics as a financial backer of the National Peasants' Party. He had enduring collaborations with Virgil Maguru and Demi Dobrescu. In tandem, he joined a camarilla formed around King Carol II, constantly bribing him and his mistress, Elena Lupescu. Such behavior drew negative attention to his businesses, particularly since Auschnitt used his political connections to secure Romanian state contracts, on which his fortune largely rested. His alleged corruption, along with his ethnicity and his publicized anti-fascism, made him a target for verbal and physical attacks by the far-right movements, in particular the Iron Guard. Auschnitt attempted to defuse this threat by paying public tributes to Romanian nationalism and, more discreetly, by sponsoring the Guardist network. His 1935 marriage to Augustin Porti's daughter, and his conversion to Roman Catholicism, elicited additional controversy. Auschnitt found himself at odds with Karol after a string of matrimonial, economic, and geopolitical disputes. Marginalized by the passage of racial laws in 1937, he was further maligned when Karol's National Renaissance Front pursued a rapprochement with Nazi Germany. He was arrested shortly after the start of World War II, and imprisoned following a show trial. In the process, he lost his UDR shares, which went to Malaxa and Albert Goring, and then his citizenship. Karol himself fell from power in 1940, with Ion Antonescu replacing him as dictator. Despite being anti-Semitic, this new regime bargained over TNC shares, and finally cleared Auschnitt of all charges in 1942. Once freed, he turned to sponsoring opposition groups, and was also involved in helping fellow Jews to escape the Holocaust. He had a minor role in plotting the anti-fascist coup of 1944, though he himself had to flee Romania before the event, and was sentenced to death in absentia. Returning to assist the Allied Commission, he was slowly pushed back into exile by signs that the Romanian Communist Party was establishing a new dictatorship. The new communist regime again withdrew Auschnitt's citizenship, before pronouncing him guilty of treason. This charge referred to Auschnitt's involvement with anti-communist resistance groups, including his allegedly financing Nicolae Petriciu's Iron Guard cells. Stripped of his Romanian properties, Auschnitt relaunched himself as an entrepreneur in the plastics industry, and obtained American citizenship. His final political activities were as a sponsor of the Romanian National Committee, which split into pro-Auschnitt and pro-Malaxa factions, respectively led by Constantin Vizoianu and Nicolae Radescu. Biography. Beginnings. Auschnitt was the scion of Ukrainian Jewish immigrants, though he may have claimed Sephardic ancestry. A hostile piece by journalist Romulus Damian claims that the Auschnitts, including Max's father Olias, his mother Clara, and his elder brother Edgar, had illegally crossed into the Romanian kingdom from Galicia, and then bribed the authorities into obtaining citizenship. Known in early records as Osis Auschnitt, Max's father had a background in the iron trade. He registered his own import-export firm in the port city of Galati on June 14, 1884. Olias steadily amassed a large fortune, which in 1908 included one of Romania's two largest entrepots, and which Max would later treble. The family home in Baladi was situated across from that of Panayot Malaxa, uncle of Auschnitt's lifelong business rival, Nicolae Malaxa. According to one account, Max grew up in Baladi, his native city, and attended the same school as Virgil Magiru, who was to become his political associate. This is contradicted by other records, which note that Olias had been moved back into Austria-Hungary shortly after Max's birth, meaning that the latter spent all his childhood years in Vienna, only returning to Baladi in 1910. It is known that he studied abroad, in Vienna and London, graduating from the Academy for Advanced Commercial Studies. Upon regaining Romania, he formed a commercial firm dealing in Austrian sheet iron imports, and then set up the kingdom's first wire manufacturing plant. Rumors surfaced that such ventures were being propped up financially by the Austrian secret police. Several members of the Auschnitt family, including Max, served in the Romanian army during the campaigns of World War I, which resulted in the establishment of Greater Romania. Auschnitt moved his offices to the Banat once that region united with Romania, entrusted with the administration of the Iron Domains and Factory (UDR). According to his own account, he was asked to become full manager of that company in 1929, after stocks had plummeted. He established an empire that included the UDR, as well as smaller factories or mines in such places as Anana, Armenis, and Buxa. His land property was said to cover 150,000 acres, including 11,000 hectares of forest outside Nadrag. Auschnitt went on to serve as president of the Banat's General Association of Industry and vice-general of the Union of Industrialists of Romania. Dubbed Iron King and Romania's Zaharov, he was overall the greatest power in Romania's armament, mining and metal industries. Together with his brother Edgar, Max owned several steel and munitions businesses including the Titan Nadrag Kalin (TNC) chain, which is claimed to have employed over 4,900 workers. Through this group, formed in 1924, Max was connected to Vickers Armstrongs, making him a participant in the European arms trade. This reflected his Anglophile outlook, first brought up when he defended Vickers against rivals at Skoda. Auschnitt was especially successful as owner of the UDR, which had amassed 1 billion lei in capital. This enterprise alone had 17,000 salaried workers, covering 80% of Romania's steel production, and 50% of locomotives, while acquiring most of Astra Brasov, an automotive plant, and minority shares in Galati shipyard. From 1930, a syndicate comprising the TNC, Creditanstalt, and Crisovaloni Bank controlled 60% of UDR shares, while Vickers had an additional 13%. From 1934, the UDR agreed to co-sponsor all state orders for Vickers cannons and ammunition. Auschnitt claimed that Edgar alone ran TNC from 1929, but his connections to that company surfaced in later talk about his conflicts of interest. He was also among the managers of various foreign companies in Central Europe, as well as of Romanian-based companies, including Crisovaloni and the Romanian Telephone Company. In 1931, he allied himself to Malaxa in order to acquire controlling interest in Creditanstalt. This business was overseen through their consortium, the Compagnie Européenne de Participations Industrielles (CEPI), which operated out of Monaco. A brainchild of the Auschnitt brothers, CEPI also provided security for Vickers' return on investments, which, in Monaco, were free of currency restrictions and political danger. Journalists circulated rumors according to which Auschnitt had enjoyed a close connection to Carol Karaman, who, in 1930, became Carol II, King of the Romanians. According to such reports, it was he who arranged for Carol to meet and fall in love with Elena Lupescu, while also sponsoring him during his 1920s exile. Auschnitt belonged to a branch of Romanian Freemasonry, frequenting Mesterul Mano Lodge alongside Malaxa and Aristide Blanc, and, through it, sponsoring Revista Fundatual Regale, a political-cultural journal. All three financiers were also visible members of Carol's Camarilla, although Auschnitt's inclusion was comparatively late. By January 1936, 6 former finance ministers, including 2 of the National Peasants' Party, PN, were reportedly serving on the TNC's executive board. Such connections became the source of controversy, since Auschnitt, like Malaxa and Dumitru Mochiornida, thrived on government contracts. As noted by economic historian Hertier Dan, these figures prospered strictly from contracts involving the state. Similarly, historian Ion Skurtu mentions the huge profits collected by Auschnitt and Malaxa from such ventures, and how these were shared with Carol and his courtiers, including Ernest Erderanu. According to Skurtu, Carol was first persuaded to form this ring in June 1931, when Malaxa and Auschnitt presented him with a large bag of cash. Iron Garden wedding affair from 1929 to 1933. Auschnitt represented Galati Chamber of Commerce and Industry in the Senate of Romania. Although he ran and won as an independent, he became a supporter and financial backer of the then governing PN. Lawyer memoirist Peter Pandrea alleges that Auschnitt had corrupted his old friend Magiru, who was by then the PN ideologue, ensuring that Magiru never acted in the interest of Romanian peasants. According to files kept by agents of the Seguranta, Auschnitt was also especially close to politician Demi. Dobrescu.at, a time when 32% of Romanian commercial enterprises were owned by Romanian Jews. Ethnicity and a high profile in financial life made Auschnitt a topic of anti-Semitic libel, including blackmail by the Iron Guard. Already in the late 1920s, Auschnitt allegedly purchased scrap iron from Iron Guard cooperatives, as a means to disguise his purchase of influence. However, protection remained uncertain. According to one report, an associate of the Guard, George Beza, received 20,000 lei from Constantin Siorchidin, manager of TNC, to assassinate his boss. Siguranta records also include allegations that Auschnitt, Malaxa and Dobrescu were behind the magazines Credinta and Flow Area to Foc, launched by Sandu Tudor in an attempt to promote Christian anti-fascism. It remains more credibly attested that Auschnitt was by then a sponsor of anti-fascist campaigns in various other newspapers and journals. In late 1933, a Guardist death squad murdered Prime Minister Ion Duca, exposing the movement to Carol's violent retaliation. As reported by writer R.G. Waldeck, the Guardist leader Corneliu Zelia Codreanu, fearing for his life, messaged Auschnitt the warning, "If you don't find a way to save me, you'll be bumped off next." According to this account, Auschnitt and Lupescu, by then a royal mistress, hid Codreanu from the authorities, and also negotiated a truce. Waldeck also claims that Auschnitt and Malaxa agreed to finance the Iron Guard, thus ensuring its political survival into the post-Duke era. The allegation was also publicized by Panayot Istrati, who sympathized with the anti-Codreanu group, the Crusade of Romanianism. He noted that Guardists took Auschnitt's money while still raining violence on lower-class Jews, who were powerless. According to historian Grigor Tryoyan Pop, the claim that Auschnitt was Codreanu's sponsor is fundamentally inaccurate, and planted in the public arena by Blanc and Victor Imandi, who were Auschnitt's rivals at the court. Several Guardists have independently confirmed that Auschnitt advanced sizable contributions to their cause over an unspecified period, though, as noted by historian Roland Clark, these merely showed that he wanted his business protected from harm. The conflict between Codreanu and Auschnitt was finally resumed in 1934, when the Guard's press referred to Max Auschnitt the Kike, national bloodsucker, as the power behind the throne. This notion was also embraced by the Romanian Front, FR, a far-right dissidents of the PN, whose newspapers claimed that the Kike Max Auschnitt had steadily raised the price of iron after 1930. As Damian argued, he, the Jew from Galicia, determined whether or not the Romanian peasant deserved to own a plow. He dictated the price of nails, of corrugation, of iron, or heating stoves, of gutter pipes, of anything iron-related. Auschnitt's first marriage was to a Jewish woman, who in March 1924 gave birth to a son, later known as Steve Auschnitt. A widower by 1932, Max was then engaged to Leonora Bruck, daughter of the White Raja, Charles Wiener Bruck, whom he was set to marry in September 1933. The wedding was called off, allegedly because Lenore favored another lover. Auschnitt remained noted for his escapades with film stars and high society ladies, before finally marrying Livia Pordy, also rendered as Prodi or Pordinu, from a political family of Cluj. His father-in-law was Augustin Pordy, at the time of serving as vice president in the Senate. The wedding came in January 1935, at the same time as Auschnitt's conflict with the Iron Guard, and therefore had to take place in secrecy, at Augustin Pacha's chapel in Timisoara. Respecting the wishes of his in-laws, Auschnitt abandoned Judaism and converted to Catholicism. Reputedly, the issue of his conversion only served to enrage his Guardist adversaries. It also caused a polemic in religious circles, sparked by the observation that the Portys were Greek Catholics, whereas Auschnitt had opted for the Roman Catholic Church. Pandrea claims that Magiru became the Auschnitt's godfather, though other sources contrarily allege that he was their godson. Auschnitt bought his family the George Manu Villa on Alea Alexandru, Derbenti, Bucharest. Designed by Grigor Cerchez, and partly redecorated by Auschnitt himself, it was situated very near to Mulaxe's residence. The Billionaires Club, which reunited Auschnitt with Mulaxa and Constantin Argetoianu, was housed at this location until 1937, when its members rented Elisabeta Palace. Argetoianu reports that, in 1937, Auschnitt also attempted to buy a portion of Romania's sugar industry from Creditanstalt, which had foreclosed various Romanian refineries. He found himself overwhelmed by liabilities and resold his shares to Carol II, who immediately obtained a debt restructuring. For a while, the new couple was especially close to Lupescu, for whom Auschnitt and other Camarilla businessmen villas in Dorobanti and Sinaia. Auschnitt alone purchased from the Aga Khan the steed Ferdusi, which he then presented as a gift for Carol. According to reports by Carol's lawyer George Taburi, Auschnitt and Mulaxa met in Lupescu's house for poker matches, using gold coins as tokens. Argetoianu notes that Auschnitt made sure to play a losing hand. Auschnitt's extreme wealth made him into a patron of the arts. Though a Catholic, he donated to the Orthodox parishes in Hozesti and Saxony. From 1935, his donations helped Gavril Marinescu build an administrative palace for the Romanian police. One anecdote suggests that Auschnitt also heard actors Grigor Vasiliu Berlic and Ion Ioncovescu plead for financial assistance, before presenting them with a literal wall of cash, and asking them to pick out a layer of money. His social advancement also raised the profile of Livia's brother, August Gustav Pordy, who took as his lover the actress Elvira Godianu. Marginalization. Auschnitt also remained discreetly involved in political life, a sponsor of less radical nationalist platforms, leading to paradoxes. One such incongruity is noted by Pandrea, according to whom the PN used Auschnitt's recent subsidies to publish Ernest Ena's calls to nationalize Romania's heavy industry. In late 1936, rumors that he had attended a hunting party with PN leaders Iuliu Maniu and Ion Mihalac were dismissed by the party press as intended to stoke the people's animosity. With the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, Auschnitt maintained a personal friendship with the Francoist ambassador, Pedro Prat y Sauauzo. Prat claimed that Auschnitt sponsored his diplomatic mission, though, as noted by scholar Judith Keene, this too was an attempt by the businessman to appease the Romanian fascists. In August 1937, the FR's Alexandru Vaidovod claimed that Auschnitt had even acknowledged employment discrimination favoring Romanians as a positive. Vojta hypothesized that Auschnitt's baptism had changed his perspective on Romanianization. He also hinted that such messaging was vetted by the PN, which was courting the far right. During that same interval, Octavian Goga noted that PN figures were borrowing ideas from his own National Christian Party, and, posing as nationalist reformers, presumably with Mr. Auschnitt's blessing. From September, Auschnitt's activities became a main topic of scrutiny for the pro-fascist Daily Universal, whose staff believed that he was behind Zaharia Stanciu's left-wing newspaper, Lumea Romaniisca. Ahead of national elections in December, Auschnitt became a Senate candidate for the PN. As noted by Argetoianu, the Iron Guard believed that Auschnitt was maneuvering to set up a new government team under Ion Mihalik, which greatly enraged Codreanu and his followers. However, the allegation was dismissed by Edgar, according to whom Max was not up to anything. Eventually, Auschnitt retook a Senate seat in Romania's 1937 legislature. During the conflicts of that year, the Iron Guard reportedly threw an explosive device at the Alea Alexandru villa. After this incident, Auschnitt dispatched Steve to safety in England. He confessed being taken by surprise when Carol appointed Goga as premier, as the king never mentioned his plans to his poker partners. Early in 1937, Blank and Auschnitt, together with Wilhelm Filderman and Armin Calinescu, had drafted a plan for the mass emigration of Romanian Jews to mandatory Palestine. This attempt was foiled by opposition from both Britain and Nazi Germany. In February 1938, Auschnitt announced that he was giving up on politics and moving abroad, sparking alarm that he was going to create chaos by also giving up on his managerial duties. As he explained at the time, he only pondered exile because of Goga's racial laws, which were specifically targeted at Jews. Only days after, Carol II staged a self-coup, outlawing all political parties and replacing them with the National Renaissance Front. The anti-Semitic legislation, passed in 1937, was tightened and extended. This regime also formalized Carol's growing disdain for Auschnitt, which reportedly began when Livia refused Carol's sexual advances, or when Lupescu grew jealous that she would not. Auschnitt himself was notoriously unfaithful to his wife, spending his money on sexual escapades in Vienna. From March 1939, Carol directed Romania's political and economic rapprochement with Germany. This move alienated Auschnitt, who feared Nazi racial policies. His memorandum on the matter reached Carol and Magiru, but had no success. The same month, Romanian diplomat Viorel Tili, who had once served as Auschnitt employee, attempted to engineer a government reshuffle and steer Romania back into the anti-German camp. Auschnitt was often credited as the mastermind behind Tili's action, though Tili himself later revealed that he was urged on by people close to Malaxa. In July, Carol shelved the plan for an Anglo-Franco-Romanian joint venture, reportedly objecting that its two would-be managers, Auschnitt and Oskar Kaufmann, were Jewish. Later that month, Orgiden, who was seen as Auschnitt's man, was voted off the UDR board. Soon after this, Auschnitt was no longer invited to Lupescu's poker evenings. On August 18, he resigned from the UDR, citing no explicit reason. The pretext was offered by his alleged conflict of interest. Auschnitt was claimed to have tampered with a signed UDR contract in order to obtain state compensation for TNC budgetary losses. Auschnitt is cited by Argetoianu as emotionally shaken by the interpretation of facts, openly denying that the document in question was ever modified. The diarist notes that Erdoğan, who has a nose for these things, had come to openly disrespect Auschnitt long before heading the investigation at Reseda. This issue is attested in other records, which, Skirtu notes, show Erdoğan constantly engaged in undermining Auschnitt's reputation. Commenting on Auschnitt's character in his own diary, Carol surmises, "A Yid is still a Yid, no matter how nice he might be as a man." Erdoğan allegedly concluded that Auschnitt had also clogged the UDR with Jews and Hungarians, and insisted that this was additional proof of malfeasance. Argetoianu additionally reports that both Auschnitt and Kaufman had by then been involved in insider trading at the credit bank, from which they drew a profit of 6 million lei between them. Their momentary success was offset by Edgar Auschnitt, who lost 3 million lei playing backgammon against Konstantin Cantacuzino. First trial news of Auschnitt's defeat by Malaxa were recorded by socialite Marta Bibesco as evidence that a British pawn had lost to a pawn or half-pawn of the German financiers. Similarly, economist Kurt Lachmann places blame for Auschnitt's ouster on the anti-Semitic campaign in Romania, financed by the Nazis. In Germany, the Völkischer Beobachter openly celebrated the Auschnitt's downfall. Auschnitt's opposition to Nazi policies entered a new stage in March 1939, just before the Allied powers renewed their commitment to defending Poland from Nazi encroachment. Historian R. P. T. Davenport-Hines suggests that Auschnitt may have been responsible for strengthening the Anglo-Polish military alliance in that he circulated an alarmist claim, namely that Germany had issued an ultimatum for Romania to join the Axis. In September, during the Nazi invasion of Poland, Auschnitt retaliated against the Nazis by assisting Polish refugees. In October, the king allowed Imandi to draft new regulations for Societés Anonymes, specifically designed to harm Auschnitt. The latter was being interrogated by prosecutors regarding his UDR contracts. Business rivals were then allowed to engineer a trial against Auschnitt, who was accused of fraud and money laundering. Various observers believed that he was no longer willing to share his profits with the Camarilla, which made him a target for retribution. Argetoianu adds speculation that Karol was resentful because his stocks in the Lugeni sugar refineries, obtained from Auschnitt, had been subject to litigation, or that the king intended to please Adolf Hitler by sacrificing his own kikes. The interpretation is partly backed by sociologist Mike Garland, according to whom Max Auschnitt, a man close to the royal house, was arrested only because he was Jewish. The disgraced courtier kept in his desk a document showing that Karol was fully responsible for the sugar debacle. A public enemy number 1, Auschnitt was also expected to relinquish his UDR shares. According to one account, he agreed to sell only if he was guaranteed immunity from prosecution and allowed to settle in France, where Livia had already relocated. A deal was reached, but Auschnitt was still arrested on the border. Argetoianu partly backs this rumor, by relaying a story allegedly told by Imandi, according to which Auschnitt agreed to cede his stock if promised an immunity from prosecution. His proposal, Argetoianu notes, was simply denied. Though selected by Karol to serve as prime minister during the same interval, Argetoianu still viewed the affair as a settling of scores, and asked not to be involved on either side. With Auschnitt taken into police custody on the evening of November 8, the censorship office was instructed to allow the publication of any reportage that would detail the reasons behind his arrest. As he was being relocated to Bucharesti prison that same day, Argetoianu read his grounds for indictment and concluded that his friend was not in fact innocent, though the trial he faced was likely to be unfair. The matter was personally handled by Gavrila Marinescu, who was Argetoianu's Minister of Internal Affairs. He cited his moral debt to Auschnitt in an attempt to recuse himself, but Karol insisted that he pursue the investigation, noting that Auschnitt was symptomatic for a corrupt system, and that a show trial would commence the purge of Romanian industry. On November 14, the authorities raided TNC offices, arresting General Manager Konstantin Nagy and 4 other directors who, they claimed, were controlled by Auschnitt. They also detained an unnamed witness, whose testimony allowed them to recover 10 million French francs that Auschnitt had deposited with a former in-law, Aronovasi. Prosecutors also looked into another issue of conflicting interests, noting that Auschnitt had used CEPI to buy off UDR assets. On December 9, a new cabinet, headed by George Tatarescu, stripped Max and Edgar Auschnitt of their Romanian citizenship. Edgar had by then escaped to London, which allowed government to confiscate and redistribute his assets in Romania. Livia, meanwhile, was spotted on the French Riviera, allegedly pursuing an affair with Kurt von Pogwitz Reventlow. Argetoianu assesses that Auschnitt's imprisonment had by then brought a great surge in the king's popularity, since the public, especially the nationalist and anti-Semitic circles, could now believe that the tide was turning on his Camarilla. He comments on demonstrative gestures by the authorities, which include forcing Auschnitt into the regular police van. Argetoianu also writes that Philo-Semites were baffled by Karol's clampdown, and exaggerated its meaning. He illustrates this with a quote from General Eugeniu Vardaanu, who was reportedly Auschnitt's friend. "This is the Dreyfus affair in its Romanian version. Despite his subjects' enthusiasm, the king never agreed to have other Camarilla men prosecuted for their alleged misdeeds." As noted by researcher George Eniche, the affair showed the power that of Romanian secret services had in influencing legal procedures, especially so since Malaxa, whose name had been cited in similar allegations, was never convicted. In February 1940, N.I.D. Dumitrescu publicized a full record of illegal deals involving Malaxa, who had left the country on an extended leave, but Karol ordered Marinescu not to follow up on this lead. On March 14, Auschnitt was sentenced to a 6-year term in labor camps, and ordered to pay back 200 million lei, approximately £140,000 in 2016 rates. In June, while filing his appeal from Daftana prison, he made a final attempt at placating the Camarilla, offering to split his UDR shares between CEPI and Malex's companies. This message failed to impress. His UDR stock was confiscated without him being involved. Auschnitt's shares were reportedly split between the Nazi iron conglomerate and Malaxa. According to Lachman, Albert Göring terrorized the Romanian government into issuing more shares that his firm then acquired. Antonescu years. In September 1940, following public outrage over the Second Vienna Award, Karol was deposed and exiled, alongside his mistress. The National Legionary State was established as a partnership between the Iron Guard and General Ion Antonescu. The Guard opened up Lupescu's residence, reportedly showing that she still kept Livia Auschnitt's portrait. Antonescu was lenient toward her husband, dispatching him to a sanitarium, but also continued to enforce and enhance anti-Semitic laws. Such policies remained unchanged when the Guard was ousted in January 1941, as Romania remained closely aligned with Germany. In December 1941, Antonescu noted of Auschnitt, "Once a kike, always a kike." He openly acknowledged that Auschnitt was in fact innocent of any crime, and favored allowing him to leave Romania if he would transfer all his property to the state. This attempt was foiled by protests from Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister. Despite further outrage from such circles, Antonescu's courts commuted Auschnitt's sentence into a forced labor at the TNC, meaning that he was effectively on parole. In October 1941, Auschnitt offered to donate his share of the TNC to a state company. His proposal caused much embarrassment for Antonescu's ministers, since accepting under the circumstances would have looked like they're blackmailing a prisoner. Antonescu himself intervened to chide Orjhiden and Alexandru Ancelescu for stalling. In January 1942, Auschnitt sorted the issue by appointing Orjhiden as caretaker of his estate, which allowed for TNC stock to be issued and bought by the state using Auschnitt's money. In May 1943, the UDR, managed at the time by Göring and physicist Helria Hulubai, reported capital gains of 37.8 million lei obtained from the Auschnitt and CEPI transactions. Meanwhile, operating through the Cisatlantic and Cisoceanic Consortia, Edgar was able to purchase an interest in the Romanian munitions manufacturer, IRMC. He finally moved to the United States in early 1942. Here, a forged equipment he had ordered in 1939 was confiscated by the Office of Alien Property Custodian, and made available for use by the United States Navy. Eventually, Anton Siu's review of previous court verdicts reached Auschnitt's case. Unusually for a Jew in that context, he was cleared of the charges and released on July 3, 1942. Around that time, Auschnitt managed to transfer money from his accounts with the Swiss Bank Corporation to a cell of anti-fascist exiles in England, which was overseen by Gregor Gafencu. The stipend of £6,000 was Gafencu's main source of revenue in 1943. In August 1942, Auschnitt and Franz von Neumann donated 50 million Swiss francs to a charity managed by Maria Antonescu. This was a precautionary measure against the planned transport of Banat Jews to Nazi extermination camps, and may have contributed to the halting of all such transports. Auschnitt also partnered with Arthur Tester, whom he himself described as naturally an anti-Semite, but a civilized one. Tester organized transports of Romanian Jews to Palestine in exchange for Auschnitt's cash. Auschnitt also donated for a makeshift healthcare center at the Jewish labor camp in Kotroseni, after Colonel Agapescu allowed Maximilian Popper to provide medical treatment for the inmates. Auschnitt's relative freedom still irked Nazi observers. In May 1943, the genocidal Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann was working on the case, insisting that Nazi spies were to prevent Auschnitt from leaving Romania. During the early months of 1944, Auschnitt was reportedly allowed access into the Ministry of National Economy, alongside Orgiden. He was allegedly spotted there by jurist Constantin Ceausescu, who exclaimed, "There is that con artist Auschnitt, walking about like it's nobody's business." A piece in the Jewish Herald described Auschnitt as an apostate Jew, close friend of the Nazi puppet premier of Romania General Antonescu. In fact, Auschnitt was by then financing the underground Romanian Communist Party, which intended to topple Antonescu. His donations, formally presented as humanitarian contributions for jailed militants, reached PCR organizer Lucreciu Patrascanu through Belu Ziller and Remus Koffler. Second trial in August. Auschnitt eventually caught news that Nazi envoys wanted him included in what was to be the final stage of Holocaust crimes in Romania. One report additionally suggests that he was briefly held at a concentration camp in Hungary. Aviator Matei Fica Cantacuzino, who was Auschnitt's personal friend, agreed to fly him into Allied territory. They used Fica's Heinkel He-111, which had been ordered to Ionka. The flight, which landed in British Cyprus on June 15, 1944, also transported businessman Alexandru Racoda and Radu Hermuzescu. In British records, their group was codenamed Yardam, and Auschnitt was Cocoon. Their escape served to prepare the anti-fascist coup of August 23. Auschnitt had brought with him messages sent by PN leader Iuliu Maniu, agreeing to Anton Siu's overthrow, as well as a letter from Patrascanu. Protected by the Royal Air Force, Fica then flew his passengers to Aleppo, where they met Maniu's liaison, Constantin Vizoianu. Auschnitt was then transported to Egypt, as he and Hermuzescu still had to be screened by Security Intelligence Middle East as potential Nazi spies. This referred to their links with Tester, which, Auschnitt convincingly explained, had reaped humanitarian benefits for Romanian Jews. Auschnitt was released at Cairo, but his lavishness with money remained a point of contention for the remainder of his stay. On July 5, a military court of the Third Romanian Army issued warrants for all fugitives. Auschnitt was charged with defection to the enemy and instigating desertion. He was then tried in absentia and sentenced to death. The same verdict was pronounced against Ghika. During the coup, Auschnitt's car was reportedly borrowed by Patrascanu, who used it to transport Petru Groza out of Deva. Immediately following these events, Auschnitt sent letters home demanding that Antonescu aide Valentin Georgescu face punishment for his wartime activities. He also asked to purchase the archives captured from Anton Siu's spy chief, Eugene Cristescu, which included minute details on communist networks active in Romania. signaling his anticipation of the communist takeover. Auschnitt mapped out a plan of action, including the creation of a pro-capitalist information service within the workers' world. In September, the United States Army Air Forces flew him back to Bucharest, where he was awarded protection by the Allied Commission, and allowed to assist in reconstruction. His 1940 trial was again up for review in November, when another court confirmed his innocence. In December, Nicolae Radescu took over as prime minister, noting with alarm that Auschnitt had resumed his conflict with Mafia, to the point of paralyzing Romania's transport industry. In December 1944, when he founded a Swiss Balkan finance and trading company, he was registered as residing on Campaninu Street, 2. He and Mafia both entered a new Masonic lodge, called Lantul Air, where, in 1945, they initiated Hulubai.Auschnitt was secretly backing Radziu's coalition against the rising PCR, who wanted Groza as prime minister. In early 1945, the two rival camps clashed in the streets of Bucharest, leading to a communist takeover. As reported by Pandrea, Auschnitt unsuccessfully supported an anti-communist counter-coup, and was identified by other participants as Romania's would-be finance minister. On March 9, 1945, as Groza formed a communist cabinet, Auschnitt catered champagne for a pro-communist group, the Romanian Society for Friendship with the Soviet Union, later becoming vice president of its economic section. He claimed to have been approached by Soviet General Ivan Sisayakov, whom he advised to recruit economic experts from outside the PCR. According to Auschnitt's own data, the Soviet state took over 30% of UDR shares as part of the reparations plan, their assistance actually preventing the factories from going bankrupt. He and Mafia were considered for a partnership in the forestry Sovrom, Soviet-Romanian joint venture, until Groza vetoed the proposal. Auschnitt, who expressed his disdain for Sovroms and for Malex's willingness to participate in them, had recovered some of his UDR stock. He was still prevented from reusing his villa, which was requisitioned by the Red Army in 1946. In tandem, Auschnitt served as vice president of a rival club, called Friends of America. General Courtland V.R. Schuyler also viewed him as a trusted advisor. Together, they met with Constantin Titel Petrescu of the Social Democratic Party, who reassured them that he was only allied with Groza and the PCR until a change of setting would allow him to break away. Resuming his lifestyle, Auschnitt organized a lavish party for New Year's Eve, serving Krauchen and caviar to his 200 guests. These included General Schuyler and Kathleen Harriman, daughter of diplomat W. Averell Harriman. Information Prahove journalists commented that the event was in poor taste. At a time when Romania's children were starving, they appealed to Auschnitt's Christianity, asking him to donate more to charities. Third trial. Auschnitt still hoped that the Potsdam Conference would push back Soviet hegemony in Romania, but reassured Schuyler that he was prepared to leave the country at a moment's notice. His offices on Campaninu Street was frequented by British spies Archibald Gibson and Ted Masterson, both of whom were also Freemasons. Auschnitt allegedly informed them on the state of Romania's economy. In a November 1945 interview with Mark Foster Etheridge, he spoke about the communist zeal and incompetence as being responsible for the massive inflation. He also contended that industrial workers and peasants, wishing to be left alone, had turned virulently anti-communist. He claimed to have personally solved a labor dispute at Astra-Persov once he prevented workers from sacking the managerial staff. Under interrogation by communist authorities, several Freemasons reported that Auschnitt and Reseda engineer Alexandru Pop, as members of the Big Finance Club, had agreed to sponsor opposition groups, including the PN, in preparation for parliamentary elections in November 1946. Also to these sources, the effort was coordinated by American envoys. Alexandru Grigoriu, himself an industrialist and a Mason, noted that Auschnitt personally handled grants for Titel Petrescu and Anton Dumitriu, who had by then formed an independent Social Democratic Party. Working as a diplomat, Gustav Porty sensed the changing of fortunes, and opted to defect in 1947. According to historian Dinu Zamfarescu, the Portys were actually protected by Groza, who allowed both Gustav and Livia safe passage when their father promised to donate all his assets to the Romanian state. Gustav was sent to an obscure post in The Hague precisely because he could then escape, together with his many children. Sources differ as to where his brother-in-law was living at the time. A report by the Soviet spy Pivovarov, issued in June 1947, claims that Auschnitt has been in the U.S. for over a year, and that, with Malaxa, he was attempting to channel American funding for Romania's industrial effort. Other accounts suggest that Auschnitt remained in Romania for several years, although being singled out by Groza's government as a sponsor of the anti-communist underground. As such, he was briefly detained in 1947. Schuyler finally warned him that his life was in danger, prompting Auschnitt to relocate in France at some point before August 15, 1947. Records kept by the new communist regime suggest that Auschnitt, like Malaxa, successfully persuaded communist ministers to let him leave for the United States as a negotiator of trade deals. The allegation was stated by Anna Pauker, who represented the PCR's internationalist circles against national communists such as George Georgiou. She implied that Auschnitt had won them over with his patriotic rhetoric. Pauker's faction believed that Ion George Maurer was particularly at fault for the gaffe. In August 1948, Auschnitt was included on a list of exiles who were stripped of their Romanian citizenship, alongside Lupescu, Moise Ernita, Ion Pangel, Ion Samgeorgiu, and some others. On June 11, the UDR had been nationalized, before most of it was transformed into a Sovrome medal in August 1949. A full confiscation of all property owned by Auschnitt and Malaxa, and a confirmation of their loss of citizenship, was rendered official by the Great National Assembly on October 5, 1948. On October 12, Auschnitt was formally indicted for various crimes, including high treason and conspiracy against the constitutional order, at Bucharest's military tribunal. A mandate was issued for his arrest, but he could not be located. Auschnitt's defection happened just before he could be implicated in a show trial against engineer Pop, himself accused of having masterminded a terrorist plot. As noted by memoirist Aurel Savin, the judicial fabrication was visible from the list of defendants, which included Auschnitt, a Jew, alongside the Iron Guards Nicolae Petrescu and wartime Admiral Horia Misalariu. Contrarily, historian Lucian Nastase believes that the prosecutors were correct in describing Auschnitt as a Petrescu supporter, and also in identifying Auschnitt as the UDR sponsor behind a large Zionist network transporting Jews out of Romania. The clampdown was closely followed by a purge of Social Democrats from the UDR's trade union. Traian Sursega and Georg Romadko were arrested, while Eftimi German managed to escape. SCI Circumflex NTEIA, the Communist Party organ, depicted Pop and Auschnitt as common criminals who, for years on end, have been robbing and demeaning thousands of working men and women, exploiting the blood out of them. Although Auschnitt was the richest among alleged conspirators, and therefore afforded great attention by prosecutors, his name was not included on the spurious list of would-be coup leaders. He was also the only in absentia defendant at that trial, and was sentenced to life imprisonment for the crime of high treason on November 2, 1948, though believed by some authors to have received a second death sentence. Speaking at a public rally on November 1, Finance Minister Vasil Luka proclaimed that the trial had exposed Romanian capitalists for colluding against the Soviet Union and our democratic regime's economy. This, Luka inferred, made Romanian-Soviet economic cooperation all the more imperative. Auschnitt's entire estate was confiscated, and the Villa on Alea Alexandru was assigned to Groza, who lived there for the rest of his life. It later housed the Argentinian embassy. Gazeta Literara, the communist literary magazine, took over Edgar's flat outside Piazza Romana, including its furniture. The brothers' Galati home was also taken over by the state, and from 1968 was used as a museum, showcasing the labor movement in Romania. Max Auschnitt lived for a while with Livia and Gustav's family in Biarritz, but grew estranged from his wife, and decided to settle as a bachelor in the U.S. He joined Edgar and Steve in New York City, where he acquired American citizenship, though he continued to send money to Livia and his child by her. Malaxa also headed for America, but Auschnitt repeatedly sought to prevent him from settling there. As part of this conflict, he directed a press campaign which overstated Malaxa's links with the Iron Guard, including unsubstantiated charges that Malaxa's home had been a mass murder hub for the 1941 pogrom. According to journalist Romulus Capulescu, this allegation was not proffered by Auschnitt, a decent, common-sense person, but was rather the product of spontaneous sensationalism. RNC and later years. Malaxa was finally admitted to the U.S. in 1953, after purchasing support from U.S. Senator Richard Nixon. Auschnitt's allegations were partly successful, in that Malaxa never applied for naturalization. Both rivals became engaged with the anti-communist Romanian diaspora, though from different angles. Auschnitt sought to align the Romanian National Committee, RNC, as an outlet for the PN, while Malaxa backed the more right-wing Radescu as leader of the movement. After negotiations overseen by the exiled King Michael I, the two wings reached an agreement in May 1949, but again quarreled and split up in December 1950. During the subsequent row, Radescu opened a civil lawsuit against members of Michael's retinue, alleging that, on Auschnitt's orders, they had dilapidated 3 million Swiss francs from the RNC's pool. In parallel, the RNC successfully called in the Central Intelligence Agency to examine Nixon's deals with Malaxa, until Walter Bedell Smith ordered his agents to step down. The dispute was closely followed by Romania's new secret police, the Securitate. In 1953, it took clues from a piece in the Washington Times-Herald that Auschnitt was a guardian angel for the RNC chairman, his old acquaintance Constantin Vizoianu. According to Pandrea, Auschnitt had purchased Vizoianu's services, preventing him from returning to Romania, and was using such political beggars for personal gain. As seen by Pandrea, Max I is the real king, having formed his own tiny court in New York. The connection was viewed as scandalous by Ratsiu's League of Free Romanians. Its sources indicated that there was reason to view Auschnitt as a liability, since he had been recently implicated in a scandal with loose women. Edgar was also noted for picking up girls from Barbizon 63 and getting them to attend impromptu parties in his Fifth Avenue penthouse, where he would entertain pals such as Cary Grant. During his final years, Auschnitt reoriented himself toward the budding plastics industry. He and his son Steve worked on improving plastic bag zippers, originally a Danish invention, by founding Minigrip Incorporated, which, from 1951, was under contract with Dow Chemical Company. According to Capulescu, it remained a modest enterprise, never matching the success of his earlier ventures in iron and steel. Auschnitt spent the remainder of his life at a luxurious home on Park Avenue. He died there after a prolonged illness, on January 18, 1957, though several sources cite 1959. His death was closely followed by the publication of Olivia Manning's Balkan trilogy, where he probably appears as the banker Drucker. Gustav Pordy was left destitute by his brother-in-law's departure, and for a while only made a living selling Romanian icons of his own make. As argued by Zamforescu, this precariousness led to his recruitment by security agents, who used him to influence public opinion in favor of communist Romania. In 1984, He became the first Romanian to serve in the European Parliament, where he represented the far-right National Front. During his tenure, accounts emerged that he was a covert agent, and that he had used security funds to bribe Jean-Marie Le Pen and make his way into politics. The allegations, carried by Le Matin to Paris, were also supported by various members of the Romanian exile, including Ion Mihai Pacepa. Porti took his accusers to court, and the claim was dropped once Pacepa refused to testify. Zamfarescu, who appeared as a witness, argues that the case was also harmed by a technicality, since journalist Agata Logerd had called Porti a spy. Under French law, she needed to prove that he had actually stolen military or economic secrets. Minigroup, Incorporated became a subsidiary of Illinois Tool Works, and was consequently rebaptized ITW Zippac. Steve Auschnitt, who provided a scholarship for Romanian students at Harvard University, made returns to Romania following the fall of communism in 1989. He sponsored a Max Auschnitt cycling cup and promoted Holocaust studies through a memorial library. He was awarded the Golden Key of Lugoj for his investments in that city's industry, which included a freight terminal. Together with his brother Robert, he sued Fondul Proprietatea for ownership of his father's TNC, which resulted in some compensation for property lost during the nationalization. He also received back the family villa, but sold it to politician Gigi Becali in 2009. It is now noted for featuring a monument-sized gilded crucifix. Steve continued to work in the plastics industry, filing his last patent in 2017, 2 years before his death in New York. Notes. References. External links: newspaper clippings about Max Auschnitt in the 20th Century Press Archives of the ZBW.